Today marks kind of a milestone for our congregation. Today being the first Sunday in October, we've been in this building 1 year exactly. We started worshiping here the first Sunday in October of 2022, and now we've been here 1 year. And it's been a good year, I think. Howard and I expected it to be, and David was kind of skeptical a little bit, but I think even he's kind of turned around a little bit. It has been a good year. And especially compared to the way 2022 started. Those of us who were here during those dark days, it was really bad. But we've grown a lot, and I expect we'll do more. So we're going to continue on with our sermon series of learning to follow Jesus, our servant king. And today, our topic is Jesus does all things well. Scripture reference is Mark 7, 24 through 37. I'm sure you've heard of the song, Jack of all trades and master of none. I wasn't familiar with the version that says Jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. I can see how that might be true, but in our text today from the Gospel of Mark reports to us that the people were saying about Jesus, he has done everything well. What a testimony. Jesus was and truly is the Jack of all trades and the master of all trades. How good is that? The more we learn about Jesus, the more it becomes clear that he can do all things well. The two stories that Mark relates to us today show that Jesus encountered people and ministered to them in unique and marvelous ways, showing that he does all things well. Story 1. Jesus and a Gentile mother with a demon-possessed daughter, told us in Mark 24 through 30. Mark began his story with these words. He got up and departed from there to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, but he could not escape notice. Mark chapter 7, verse 24. After reporting that Jesus' many activities in and around the region of the Sea of Galilee, Mark reports that Jesus decided to move north into Gentile territory. Perhaps he was looking for an opportunity to rest. Perhaps it was just to escape the danger of mounting opposition from the Jewish leaders of his day. Beyond the numerous times that we read about Jesus' travels into the area of Decapolis on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, this trip to the north may have been the only time that Jesus left his native land during his ministry. Tyre was about 25 miles south of Sidon and 50 miles north of Nazareth, the area called Phoenicia. It was northwest of Galilee and ran about 150 miles along the Mediterranean Sea. Those are some strange but powerful people. In fact, they seeded a lot of the early civilizations along the Mediterranean, including the ones who fought with the Romans. Can't think of them now. It starts with the C, but they were in North Africa. But they were quite a society. And Tyre had been the leading seaport of the world in the days of King David and King Solomon. Because Mark had wrote this gospel of a Gentile audience, he was careful to highlight the fact that the message of salvation wasn't limited to Israel, but is intended for the whole world, everybody. Also keep in mind that in Jesus' last teaching opportunity, he had declared the distinctions between clean and unclean, and they were being removed and cast aside in Mark 7, 14 through 23. We looked at that last week. And so Jesus ventured into Gentile territory and presumably entered the house of a Gentile, reaffirming he had rejected this notion of clean and unclean standard. Upon Jesus' arrival in Tyre, he went to a house apparently planning to spend some time there in quiet, freedom, and anonymity, but Jesus' popularity had preceded him, and somehow the news had gotten out that he had come to town. And so Mark wrote, Instead, immediately after hearing about him, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she was asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Mark 7:25-26. A Gentile woman who had somehow become a believer in Jesus heard he was in town, and she made her way directly and boldly to Jesus. Boy, I love that part. When you got a problem, go to Jesus. He'll take care of you. How did she know about Jesus? How had she heard about his power and ministry? Well, let you remind me that Mark had already reported to us that the people of Tyre had heard about Jesus. Back in Mark chapter 3, Mark had reported, Jesus departed with his disciples to the sea, and a large crowd followed from Galilee, and a large crowd followed from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, beyond the Jordan, and around Tyre and Sidon. The whole crowd came to him because they had heard everything about what he was doing. Mark 3:7 and 8. This Gentile woman knew that she'd heard none of the religious, moral, or cultural credentials necessary to approach a Jewish rabbi. She was a Phoenician, a Gentile, a pagan, a woman, and her daughter had an unclean spirit. But as a mother, as a parent, she didn't care. She didn't care. She entered the house without an invitation, fell down at Jesus' feet, begged Jesus to exorcise the demon from her daughter. The word is translated was begging, and asking him is in a present progressive form, which means that she kept on asking, kept on begging. Nothing and no one could stop her. In a parallel account in Matthew's Gospel, the disciples urged Jesus to send her away because of her excessive pleading, because she wouldn't take no for an answer. We can all understand why she had such boldness and steadfastness. She was a parent, and her child was in need. People fall into several categories: cowards, regular people, heroes, parents. A parent will do anything for their child without any thought of convention or for themselves. So it is not surprising that this desperate mother was willing to what she was willing to do for her daughter. So how did Jesus respond to her demand? Mark wrote, he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, because it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Matthew 7:27. If you're like me, then your reaction to Jesus' words is shock and horror, right? I mean, what Jesus said to her seems so offensive and insulting, right? We live in a canine-loving society, but in the New Testament times, most dogs were scavengers. They were wild and dirty. In that day, the Jews often called the Gentiles dogs because they considered them unclean. You're just scavengers. You're nothing. But was Jesus trying to be cruel and insulting? I don't think so. Many commentators have concluded that Jesus was speaking to her in a way that was parabolic. He was using a metaphor. One of the keys to understanding what Jesus said was the fact that Jesus used a very unusual word for dogs here. He used a term that means puppies. Now, who doesn't love puppies? Who doesn't love puppies? Remember, this woman was a mother, and what Jesus was saying, you know how families eat. First, the children eat at the table, and afterward their pets eat too, but it's not right to violate that order. The puppies must not eat the food from the table before the children do. I spent a little while teaching my little dog not to beg at the table. Matthew gives us a longer version of Jesus' answer, where Jesus explains his meaning. I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. We can see clearly that Jesus concentrated his ministry in Israel. He was sent to show that he was the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies. And so his words were not an insult that they appear to be, because Jesus was saying, please understand, there's an order here. I'm going to Israel first, then the Gentiles, all the other nations later. And the amazing thing is, this Gentile woman got the point of what Jesus was saying and came right back with him with an amazing reply. Mark wrote, but she replied to him, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So even if they're not begging, they're looking for you to drop something. I remember when mine was a puppy with her sister, and my wife had cooked pork chops for dinner one night, and my grandson dropped his on the floor, right in front of his dog, Bella. And she looked at it, and she was so shocked, that this was just right in front of her. And but she didn't get it. And so we got it from her right off the floor, washed it off, heated it back up, gave it to my grandson. But I think that was the last time that she ever did that, because Bella loves food. So, but yes, the crumbs fall from the table. I remember when my daughter was little, we had kind of a mutt schnauzer, but he was he'd go under there and she would drop food right from her little thing, sometimes right on top of his head. She was just wanted to see about getting to him, but sure, they eat the crumbs. The woman replied, yes, Lord, I get it, but the puppies eat from that table too, and I'm here for mine. Commentators point out that wealthy people in that day wiped their hands on chunks of bread and then threw them under the table for the dogs. Jesus had told her a parable in which he gave her something that was a challenge and an offer, and she got it, and she responded to the challenge. Okay, I understand. I'm not from Israel. I do not worship the God that the Israelites worship. Therefore, I don't have a place at the table. I can accept that. Isn't that amazing that she would be so humble? Because she was desperate. She didn't take offense. She didn't try to stand on her right. She accepted the offer by saying, all right, I may not have a place at the table, but there's more than enough at that table, but there's more than enough for everyone in the whole world. I need mine now. I'll take my place under the table and be satisfied with the scraps. Do you see how remarkable that is, that she recognized and accepted both the challenge and the offer hidden within it? Wow. Would we be willing to do the same? Let's notice the conclusion of the story, though. Mark writes, and then he told her, because of this reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. When she went back to her home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Mark 7:29-30. The Gentile mother had displayed wisdom, humility, faith, and therefore Jesus was so pleased by her response that he granted her request. When Jesus said, because of this reply, he was praising her reply like a good teacher, saying, wonderful answer, incredible answer. It's amazing that God's chosen people were often so slow to get it, but not so the Gentiles. In the Gospels, when Jesus complimented someone for their faith, they were more likely to be Gentile than Jew. Like we see here in the Gentile mother and the centurion in Matthew chapter 8. One commentator wrote, what an irony. Jesus seeks desperately to teach his chosen disciples, yet they're so dull and uncomprehending. Jesus is reluctant to even speak to a walk-on pagan woman, and after one sentence she understands his mission and receives his unambiguous commendation. And she answers Jesus from within the parable, that is, in the terms by which Jesus is addressing her, indicates that she is the first person in the gospel to hear the word of Jesus to her. Commentator James Edwards. Similarly, Martin Luther was amazed and moved by this encounter because he saw the Gospels in it. This woman understood the gospel, which declares that you're more wicked than you ever believed, but at the same time, more loved and accepted. Than you ever dared to hope. On one hand, she was so not too proud to accept what the gospel said about her unworthiness, but on the other hand, she was not too insulted or discouraged to take up God's offer. See, there are two ways to fail to allow Jesus to be your Savior. One is by being too proud, having a superiority complex that says, I'm too good to be self-sufficient, that I don't need a Savior. The other is by having an inferiority complex that says, I am so awful, God can't love me. No one is so good that they don't need God, and no one is so bad that God doesn't want them. The woman understood her need and understood God's offer. Can you imagine the grand homecoming when his Gentile mother returned home to find her little daughter freed from the demon and was whole and healthy again? Wow. Can you imagine her powerful testimony as she told others about the Jewish rabbi who exorcised the demon from her daughter with a word without even being present, miles away? And he did it for a foreign, pagan Gentile. Jesus indeed does all things well. What's your testimony about how God has freed you from? What's your testimony about how God loved you and called you from your lost and unworthy state? You've all got them. We all have them. Story number 2. Jesus and the Gentile man who's deaf. Mark 7:31-37. John MacArthur begins his commentary on this second story with a riddle. Who is permitted to speak, but is not able? And able to speak, but is not permitted? Answer, the deaf man in the story. We'll read as Mark wrote. Again, leaving the region of Tyre, he went by the way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, through the region of the Decapolis. They brought him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking and begged Jesus to lay his hand on him. Mark 7:31-32. Mark tells us that Jesus left this region of Tyre and went north through Sidon and then made the journey southeast back to the region of Decapolis. Some people speculate this whole journey may have taken as much as 8 months. After all, they were walking. Mark doesn't tell us why Jesus went that way, and he doesn't tell us anything about what happened to Jesus and his disciples traveling to Sidon and then on to Decapolis. You recall that Jesus had been to the Decapolis before, and he exorcised a legion of demons from a man and sent them into a herd of pigs who rushed to their death. And the people who witnessed that transformation begged Jesus to leave. The restored man wanted to leave with Jesus, but Jesus ordered him to stay and tell everyone what God had done for him. When Jesus arrived at Decapolis this time, he received a whole different reception. Perhaps the preaching of the formerly demon-possessed man had actually produced some fruit in many people. Mark tells us that they had brought to Jesus a deaf man who had difficulty speaking. Who they are is not described. We use they a lot, and we always scratch our heads. Who's they? They said this, they said that, they do this, Who's they? And we didn't tell us who they are here. But they are certainly people who believe that Jesus could make a difference. And just like the Gentile woman in the previous story, these Gentile people also begged Jesus for help. The man who needed healing was described as deaf. It is a term that can mean deaf, mute, or both. This man was certainly deaf and wasn't completely mute, although his deafness made it very difficult for him to speak, as often happens with deaf people. Because they can't hear from birth, they can't mimic and say the sounds exactly like people who can hear. So how did Jesus respond to their request? Well, Mark wrote, "So he took him away from the crowd in private. After putting his fingers in the man's ears and spitting, he touched his tongue, and looking up to heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Epaphra, Epaphtha, that is, be opened." Mark 7:33-34. Let's explore this story by asking some questions. Why did Jesus take this deaf man away from the crowd? Perhaps to avoid the confusion and shock that would likely take place when the man was suddenly able to hear all the sounds around him. Or perhaps Jesus wanted to protect his privacy, knowing the man had always been a spectacle with people maybe making fun of him because he couldn't hear and he spoke so strangely. Showing compassion, perhaps Jesus didn't want to make a spectacle of him now. Why did Jesus put his fingers in the man's ears? Why did he do that? And then he spit. And then he touched the man's tongue. We don't know. It wasn't because Jesus was doing some sort of hocus pocus or miracle work or incantation, because Jesus never did that while performing miracles. Perhaps Jesus was doing a rudimentary sign language to explain what he was trying to do and prepare the man for what was coming. Can you picture Jesus trying to communicate? Let's go over here. Don't be afraid. I'm going to do something about your ears and your tongue. Let's look to God for help. So why did Jesus spit? Good question. Some people believe that he spat on his own fingers and touched the man's tongue with his saliva-covered fingers. As gross as that sounds, to us it may be because that's what happened, that people believed that saliva had healing powers. The text only says that Jesus spit. He doesn't say where the spit ended up. Why did Jesus look towards heaven and sigh deeply? Jesus knew this man had spent his life reading people's facial expressions and body language. And by looking up, Jesus wanted the man to know that the help was coming from God. Whatever help or ministry that we give to others should always be done in a way that God gets the credit and the glory. By giving a deep sigh, Jesus communicated that he understood how monumental this had been this man's struggle. A better translation of sighed deeply might mean he groaned or he moaned. The moan is an expression of pain. Jesus is identifying this man's alienation and isolation. Finally, we notice that Jesus uttered a single word that changed the man's life. I'll try it again. Epaphtha. It's an Aramaic word that means be opened. Aramaic was the mother tongue of Jesus and may have been of this man, which was the result of Jesus' commands, be opened. Mark wrote, immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and began to speak clearly. He ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more they proclaimed it. Mark 7:35-36. As soon as Jesus spoke the word, immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed. I wonder the first word he heard was Jesus' word commanded, be opened. The fact that the formerly deaf man could now speak plainly shows a double miracle. Even today, if someone who is deaf can now suddenly hear because of, say, a cochlear implant, they're not always able to speak clearly immediately, and they may always have a speech impediment. I know, having lived so many years in the D.C. area near the Gallaudet University, there was quite a few deaf people around, and when I came to Florida, my company I worked for had some a pair of deaf people that you could hear. And they didn't speak the same way we did. They had a problem because, again, unless you're from a baby, learn how to mimic the words and the speak, it's tough. It's tough to speak the way other people speak. But when Jesus does a miracle, the results were instantaneous and compulsive. How ironic. This man who could now finally speak was told not to. And yet, it's beyond the human ability not to tell about such a good and miraculous thing. You know, if God does something good in your life, can you really hold it back? Can you really bottle it up and not tell anybody? I don't think so. It's something you get excited about because you're different. Things have changed for you. Things are better now. I can't bottle that up. I've got to tell other people. No matter how much our government or culture tells us to be quiet about Jesus, we cannot and must not be silenced. Later in Acts, the apostles would declare, "For we were unable to stop speaking about what we have seen and heard." Acts 4:20. We're unable. I can't not speak about it. I have to. Jesus had given that command in an attempt to control the direction of his ministry. He didn't want to only be known or thought of as a miracle worker, since his mission was much greater than that. Mark concluded this story with these words: "They were extremely astonished, and he has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." Mark 7:37. After casting out the demons from the man in Mark 5, the people had urged Jesus to leave. But now, after the great and wonderful healing, the people correctly and properly said, "He's done all things well." What a transformation from the same people. Jesus clearly did everything well, right, and good, and Jesus continues to do the same for us today. I would like to conclude today's sermon, by pointing out the fact that Mark used this story in a special way to point out our attention to a prophecy from Isaiah 35. When Mark said that the man was deaf and spoke with difficulty, he used a word that appears in only one place in the Bible, Isaiah 35. In Isaiah 35, the prophet Isaiah had this to say about the coming Messiah: "They will see the glory of God, the splendor of our God. Strengthen the weak hands, steady the shaking knees. Say to the cowardly, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God, and vengeance is coming. God's retribution is coming. He will save you." And then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf will unstopped, and the lame will leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute will sing for joy. Isaiah 35, 2b through 6a. Mark was telling his readers, do you see the blind opening their eyes? Do you hear the deaf hear? Do you see the deaf hearing? Do you hear the mute tongue shouting for joy? God has come, and just as Isaiah had promised, God has come to save you. Jesus the Messiah, the Christ, is coming to save us. Here's another thing Mark wants his readers to think about. Isaiah said the Messiah will come and save us with divine retribution. But how is the Messiah saving with divine retribution? His smiting people? Is he taking out his sword? No. Look at Jesus. He's not taking power. He's giving it away. He's not taking over the world. He's serving it and dying to save it. Where's the divine retribution? Jesus didn't come to bring it. He came to bear it. On the cross, Jesus bore our retribution so we don't have to. On the cross, the Son of God was cast away from the table without a crumb, so that those of us who are not children of God could be adopted and brought in. He became sin to take away our sin. He became mute so that our tongues might be loosed and call him King and sing his praise. Jesus loves us that much. He considers us that valuable. We must never be too proud to accept what the gospel says about our unworthiness. We must never be too downcast to accept the gospel says that how loved we are. We must never believe we're too lost that we can't be found, or too far from home that we can't return. Indeed, our Jesus does all things well. Let's give him a chance to do all things well in our lives. Jesus sets us free from our demons and sins. Jesus heals all our infirmities and binds up our brokenness, especially our spiritual ones. Jesus does all things well for everyone. No one is excluded. The gospel is for all. Whatever your need this morning, will you come as we stand and sing the song of invitation?